Tumult on the Rim of the Volcano by Christian Frehner. Switzerland concern and also agitation urge me, on the occasion of the Swiss bank holidays on the 1st of August 2022, to express some thoughts and observations on the current dangerous world situation. Who knows, perhaps my reflections will fall on fertile ground in one or the other case.
He who is silent when he is kicked is not indulgent but wretched, and he who is silent when he sees his neighbor mistreated is a traitor to the duty of life. Canon 32 verse 253.
Preface.
Especially since the outbreak of the corona rampantly spreading disease in 2019, there is a worrying restriction of freedom of expression in society fomented by politicians, the leading media, sections of the scientific establishment, and all sorts of groups, as well as an extremist-ideological-moralistic emphasis on unsubstantiated views and opinions, with cautionary voices being outnumbered in the whole cacophony and almost drowned in the din of opinion. Provided with the censorship verdict, without alternative, an official strategy is revealed that condemns, ignores, or ridicules an opinion that deviates from the state doctrine and the slogans prescribed by the state as lateral thinking. Of course, there are persons and groups who spread unfounded, insane conspiracy theories and head-shaking abstruse claims. To put up with this, and to respect it as part of freedom of expression, should actually be a matter of course in a democracy, just as it is handled with regard to those many human beings who firmly believe that the contradictory content of a book written 1500, 2000, or even earlier literally corresponds to the truth from A to Z. Although science, as well as the application of reason, rationality, and logic, come to a different conclusion. To err is, as is well known, human and to be tolerated, at least as long as it has no direct harmful effects on fellow human beings. However, if misinformation and manipulation of opinion, etc., is detected on the part of the authorities, what is called for is not silence but vigorous opposition. If reasonable, justified, and logical questions and concerns are simply ignored, then this is unacceptable and non-violent resistance is a civic duty. The pandemic provides ample illustration of official mismanagement, even exceeding competence and dissoluteness. Justified critical questions and warnings about the hastily developed novel mRNA vaccines were ignored or dismissed as irrelevant. For the first time, an entire planetary humanity was experimentally abused for drug tests, whereby the unenlightened test persons, also for the first time, had to pay for it directly or indirectly taxes, accepting potentially deadly side effects from the half-baked vaccines enriched with nanoparticles. In the meantime, it has turned out that the concerns were more than justified. The observable combination of 1, eyes closed and through, 2, Russian roulette, 3, what I don't see doesn't make me hot, and 4, principle of hope does not exactly testify to human genius. Dr. Wolf, Pfizer used dangerous assumptions, rather than research, in COVID, vax development. Because governments had done their homework sloppily or not at all in preparing for a pandemic and had failed to prevent the spread of the rampantly spreading disease by immediately stopping cross-border travel, they used the hype about the miracle vaccine developed at record speed to conceal their general failure. This was supported by pressure from the economy, and above all, also from that part of the population that blindly believed the promises of the vaccine developers and the authorities, and to whom the effective vaccine hailed with media fanfare seemed like a revelation from heaven. Not thinking that the development of a safe vaccine requires years of research, because research also includes the determination of possible harmful long-term effects, many, in their fear of death, and annoyed by the restrictions on the vaccine created by the lockdown, saw the longed-for emergency exit back to the usual everyday life. Well, in the meantime, the media focus has shifted from the battle zone of the corona epidemic to yet another war issue, and, accompanied by shrill, same-march slogans, respect for human beings with dissenting opinions is eroding even faster. An ideology and mass suggestive propaganda based on hypocrisy, vengefulness, arrogance, and prohibitions of thought have taken root like another rampantly spreading disease in the political establishment and the public service information channels of the self-declared Western democratic community of values. Instead of using and recognizing human qualities such as rationality, foresight, analysis, and a sense of responsibility, etc., the bubble of reality denial is inflated ever further with ideological foul gas. The reasonable and logical thought process that one should first analyze an issue, situation, or actions and understand the causes before making a judgment and taking any decisions is seen as an imposition. The fundamentally positive concept of understanding is perverted into the opposite, for example with defamatory terms such as Russia understanding or Putin understanding. If you don't agree with me, you are my enemy. For a critical, neutral observer on the sidelines of the media playing field, the following picture suggests itself. On one side, a small, quiet group of persons, mostly in uniforms, attentively watching the hectic action on the opposing half. Something is going on there. There is a fight. The persons, most of them dressed in colorful clothes, a few in uniforms, are obviously excitedly discussing, waving their arms. Slogans cheering each other on can be heard, and individuals keep running to the edge of the pitch, calling on their fans to throw them as many balls and baseball bats as possible. Others run excitedly to the center line, where they shout threats at the opposing party with raised fists. In reality, we see a multilingual hullabaloo of moralists of both sexes who, in a kind of brainstorming, are constantly coming up with further punitive measures against Russia, because despite their previous ill-considered decisions, the killing and destruction in Ukraine continues unabated. Fully focused on their escalation strategy and suppressing any doubts rising from their subconscious about the success of their actions, their whole demeanor resembles that of a person who can be seen sawing off the branch on which they are sitting on the trunk side. Since the majority of these political decision-makers, lacking strength of character or the ability to think, do not have the courage or the size to admit that they are on the wrong track and have made the wrong decisions, the spiral of irrationality turns ever further and faster towards the abyss. As prisoners of their own moralism, actually, moralism would be accurate. They do not realize in their leadership incompetence that they, like in the fairy tale of the king without clothes, are deceiving themselves and are seen by every realistically thinking and decent observer as what they really are. Naked leadership rivets. The whole misery also culminates in the terrible fact that these pseudo-elites and the stupid ones from the population, in their intellectual ignorance and warmongering, do not realize that the next world war and world conflagration has already broken out on Earth and is constantly being fanned by the irresponsible idiots. The New World War was started firstly by the unprecedented economic sanctions imposed on Russia by the USA, the EU, NATO, and a few other states, unfortunately also Switzerland, and secondly by the extensive delivery of all kinds of weapons to the warring party Ukraine. The fact that the killing and destruction continues endlessly is of no concern to these warmongers squatting in their taxpayer-funded government palaces. Puffing themselves up in their moralism, they present themselves to the public as moral beacons and saviors of the civilized world. What could be observed in the run-up to the last two world wars is also current again now. Shrill war rhetoric, slobbering war roars, and talk of final victory. When the stupid and incompetent misrule, the people suffer.
Fundamental.
Whoever seeks truth, yes, it does exist, will only find it in reality, That is to say, in the real world, but not in ideologies, theories, assumptions, wishes, assertions, illusions, or in any kind and form of belief. The prerequisites for this, however, are impartiality, logic, self-criticism, mental openness, far-sightedness, the will to learn, mindfulness, and a healthy, normally functioning brain. If all countries were neutral, that is to say neither for nor against another country, that is to say if no country interfered in the affairs of another country, there would be no wars in the world. Neutrality as a concept and value, like pregnancy and death, cannot be relativized or reinterpreted in any way. There is only an either-or, pregnant or not, neutral or not, dead or alive. Current obfuscating neologisms like cooperative or active neutrality are on the intellectual level of someone rambling, "My wife is quite pregnant." The universally valid law of cause and effect and interactions also applies to human beings, of course, and without exception. Thoughts are causes of words, feelings, and actions, and the consequences, in turn, are causes of interactions, etc. From this it follows that every human being is comprehensively responsible for what he does or refrains from doing by virtue of his thoughts. If, for example, he advocates the supply of weapons to criminals or belligerents, he is a party to the war, and thus complicit in the consequences of the use of these weapons, namely the injury or killing of fellow human beings and the destruction of infrastructure and nature. Item.
Good government, happy people?
At birth, every human being coming into the world is of absolutely equal value as any other, and consequently to be respected throughout life as a person and human being worthy of honor. Differences in value only arise in the course of life with regard to thinking, attitude, behavior, and due to further sociological, psychological, and hereditary factors, which may of course be assessed differently, whereby criminal action is certainly to be punished, but without torture and the death penalty or the shameful revenge-based eye for an eye, tooth-and-tooth principle, etc., that human beings can live together freely and peacefully in a group, in a country, requires certain informal and formal rules to be understood and accepted as tradition, manners, decency, laws and regulations, etc. Anarchy is hostile to human beings and life. Every government, and in general, every leader, has to be comprehensively concerned and is responsible to work out regulations for the welfare of the human beings under its care and to minimize damage and dangers of any kind, as well as to comprehensively care for the preservation and care of nature with fauna and flora by acting in a foresighted, prudent, and reliable just manner. At the state level, this is done by establishing and maintaining a high-quality education system with equal opportunities, through comprehensive freedom of expression, through participation, through education regarding the advantages and disadvantages of measures, through protective organizations and protective measures, as well as through fair and reasonable legislation, etc., etc. The Greek Pericles, who lived about 2,500 years ago, is credited with the following statement: "It is not our job to predict the future, but it is our job to be prepared for it." In this sense, for all decisions, a government has to evaluate in advance and farsightedly the negative and positive effects of the action in order to then choose the least harmful variant. A good government consists of human beings who are elected by the people on the basis of their conscious abilities, reason, intellect, intelligentum, drive, virtues, and irreproachable conduct of life, etc., in order to ensure on their behalf that the tasks listed above are implemented in a targeted manner and, if necessary, adapted to new circumstances. A good government is acting in a fiduciary capacity on behalf of the people, that is to say, not out of an individual desire for power, greed, or other selfish reasons. This results in the so-called direct democracy as the only form of state, because only this guarantees the sovereign, that is to say, the entirety of the electorate as the supreme determining body of the state. In this form of government, it is the people who elect persons as their representatives and directly control the fate of the state through initiatives and referendums, as well as being able to vote out unsuitable government figures if necessary. The form of government known as direct democracy is only found in one country on earth, namely Switzerland. However, it must be admitted that it is a semi-direct democracy, because both the executive, the federal council, and the higher judiciary, the judges at federal level, are not elected directly by the people, which should be the case, but by the legislature, the parliament, or the national council and council of states. All other forms of government, worldwide republics, monarchies, dictatorships, are only supposedly democracies because they prevent the comprehensive participation of the people. For this reason, the Western governments and countries, which loudly and abusively puff themselves up as democracies, have no legitimacy whatsoever to present themselves on their high horses as beacons of freedom and to peddle or proselytize with the term democratic community of values. If the people can only elect politicians every few years, if at all, who first promise the moon, but then forget everything after the election, act contrary and practically decide on war and peace without the involvement and formal consent of the people, then it is not a democracy, but a mixture of oligarchy and dictatorship. If Germany is taken as an example, it can be seen that this country is governed by parties and representatives chosen by them, and the people have practically nothing to say, at least at the federal level. Moreover, the German people only have a so-called basic law, which was written on behalf of the victorious powers for what was then West Germany, but not a constitution legitimized by a referendum. In plain language, this means that constitutionally, the German people have still been in a foreign, determined, unfinished nation status for over 77 years.
Learning from history.
China has been attacked from outside several times in its history, for example by the Mongols, the British, and the Japanese. Russia has also been attacked several times in its history, including by Poland, Lithuania, France, and most recently by Nazi Germany. The USA is the only state in the world that has not been attacked by another country in its history, nor is it currently under serious military invasion threat from outside. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor or the stationing of nuclear missiles on Cuba by Russia were not based on any invasion plans, but on threat situations for which the USA was causally responsible. Actually, the USA deserves an entry in the Guinness Book of Records for imposing sanctions on other countries and persons by far the most often and for the most creative justifications for wars abroad. The U.S. is known to be very inventive and skilled in pulling a reason for sanctions, harassment, and bullying against persons or countries out of a hat. Who knows? Maybe in the future they will expand this business and even take sanctions against nature, for example against the Cumbre Vieja volcano on Las Palmas, should it explode and the resulting monster wave destroy the cities on the American East Coast. In the last World War, the two countries attacked, Russia and China, suffered by far the highest blood toll with 24 and 20 million dead respectively, far ahead of Germany with 7.7 million, Great Britain with 450,000 and the USA with 420,000. It should be remembered that the ancestors of the European value democracies England, France, Spain, Portugal, Belgium, Italy, etc., acquired their present prosperity to a considerable extent through the exploitation and enslavement of the populations in Africa, America, Asia, Australia, and New Zealand, colonies, conquests, and at the expense of the inferior human beings and nature, mineral resources there, they have plundered together their present golden 1 billion civilization. The USA operates about 800 known military bases in over 80 countries, which corresponds to about 90 to 95% of all foreign military bases in the world. There are 194 military bases in Germany alone, and 121 in Japan, which was defeated by the USA. Russia maintains military bases in about 10 countries, most of them in the neighboring former Soviet republics. China maintains a single military base abroad in Africa. Russia, as by far the largest country on Earth with a population of around 150 million, is the only country that is self-sufficient in terms of resources, land, water, mineral resources, energy, that is to say, can supply itself and its entire population without being dependent on vital imports. Russia, therefore, has no reasonably recognizable reason to expand beyond its borders, which it has also demonstrated since the dissolution of the Soviet Union through correspondingly non-expansive behavior, quite in contrast to the USA, which, due to its peace-preventing hegemony mania, Monroe Doctrine, etc., has long been interfering in the affairs of foreign countries on all continents and is active there in war as well as in terms of intelligence services, etc., and defending the freedom of free nations. If we look at Russia's, not the Soviet Union's, military deployments abroad, they can practically be counted on one hand, and were carried out on the one hand on the basis of an agreement with the country in question, Syria, at the request of or to protect neighboring Russian-speaking populations, Ukraine, Georgia, or to ward off terrorist attacks, Chechnya. It is also obvious that Russia is not waging an area-wide war of extermination against the entire population in Ukraine, but is fighting military targets, unfortunately also against residential buildings and entire residential areas when they are used as cover and attack platforms by opposing military forces in violation of international law. The Russian military tactics are obviously in contrast to how the USA would proceed, namely first bombing the whole country without differentiating between military and civilian population, as they did in Iraq, Laos, and Vietnam, and also in the last World War with the area bombing of German cities. However, this differentiation does not change the fact that every war and every act of war leads to death and destruction and corresponds to an unforgivable crime against humanity. This applies equally to economic sanctions. Because these belong to the medieval war category, weapon of starvation, are a means of war in their own right and cause hardship, suffering, and death among innocent human beings not involved in the acts of war. Children, women, men, both in the enemy's camp and in their own. The 15 largest arms companies in the world are distributed among the following countries: USA = 7, China = 4, France, Italy, Great Britain, and Europe Airbus = 1 each. The largest 5 are U.S. corporations. In 2021, the USA once again led the ranking in terms of defense spending by a huge margin in billions of USD. USA = 801, China = 293, UK = 68.4, France = 56.6, Italy = 32. Russia, together with China, the main opponent of the monstrous Western military phalanx, spent only a fraction, 65.9 billion USD. What is important to know about the purchase of defense equipment? Anyone who buys high-tech defense systems from another country, especially from the USA, automatically enters into an expensive and momentous dependency, because the delivered weapon systems can only be used as long as the ammunition supply functions, instructions and maintenance are secured, and the secret control software is not blocked externally, or the system is not controlled by a third party. Moreover, it can be assumed with a high degree of probability that the USA will not export its latest, still secret weapons, or at most to Israel, in order to always ensure its weapons supremacy. Therefore, only obsolete war material is exported and disposed of against payment in third world countries, while the newest war equipment is secretly tested in practice in its own wars, as for example in the Iraq War, or at the time by deliberately dropping 2 different types of atomic bombs on Japan. In this way, the USA could subsequently analyze the effect directly on the ground on the subject and object, so to speak, which was then also done. As far as the current military support for Ukraine is concerned, NATO countries are giving away already paid for or written off obsolete weapons under the slogan, "Aid and support against the heinous aggressor." It is to be assumed that a secret shadow accounting is kept, which counts on a war dividend, that is to say, a financial and territorial compensation after Russia's defeat and the reparation payments imposed on it by the victorious powers. In addition, the freed-up space in the arsenal can be stocked up with the latest weapons systems, which of course pleases the so-called industrial military complex, that is to say, in particular, U.S. investment companies worth billions, such as Vanguard and BlackRock. Returning to the dropping of the 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it is to be noted that the USA thereby not only committed the greatest single war crime in the history of humanity, namely the mass killing of hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians within seconds and with terrible long-term consequences, but they also triggered the nuclear arms race and the Cold War, as well as initiating the nuclear age with all its associated threats and negative consequences for humanity and all of nature far into the future. NATO, founded in 1949, ostensibly served the purpose of preventing the expansion of the Soviet Union, although its collapse at the beginning of the 1990s actually rendered its raison d'etre obsolete. The verbal promise made by U.S. Secretary of State James Baker to Soviet President Gorbachev in February 1990 that NATO would not expand eastwards was broken as early as 1993 at the insistence of the USA. As part of the creeping eastward enlargement of NATO, membership has now risen to 30 full members with the accession of Northern Macedonia in 2020. The USA, as by far the leading arms producer and arms seller, needs an unpeaceful world and always new wars for its oil-greased arms business. The conclusions drawn from the above facts and a look at the current world situation clearly indicate that after the shameful defeats of the superpower USA in Korea, Vietnam, Somalia, Syria, and Afghanistan, a new profitable business field in Eastern Europe has matured just in time. The preparatory work that has been going on since at least 1993 is bearing golden prospects for the U.S. arms industry, but unfortunately rather dark times for the human beings on the Ukrainian chessboard or geoboard, and coming even darker prospects for Europe because the boomerang effect will not fail to materialize.
Outlook.
For years, Russia has warned in no uncertain terms that it considers and will prevent NATO membership of Ukraine and the associated deployment of offensive weapons, etc., as a direct threat and crossing of a red line. The fact that NATO is mainly represented by the USA, because the majority of the other members have only limitedly functioning armies nota bene, despite high armament expenditures, is an open secret, but is obfuscated by the many political mouthpieces with holdout slogans and puffed-up threatening gestures. But it also means that long-range NATO or American missile weapons along the long border between Ukraine and Russia, only a few hundred kilometers from Moscow, understandably pose an obvious and real threat to Russia's security. Those who dismiss this as a mirage or pure conspiracy theory or the like should imagine what would happen if Russia were to ally itself militarily with Mexico and set up missile sites there along the U.S. southern border. In contrast to the USA, which manipulates its NATO allies far away from its own territory in order to escalate the situation by massive, counterproductive sanctions, and by supplying weapons to Ukraine as well as more or less secretly by its own personnel on the ground, with the intention of weakening Russia, the mineral resources are tempting. No similar endeavor is recognizable on the part of Russia. Anyone who informs themselves with an alert mind will realize that the USA itself is a country in civilizational decline. Misguided by opaque interest groups, with a half-senile puppet as front figure, it continues to preach water to the world, but drinks wine itself. But as the saying goes, the pitcher goes to the well until it breaks, and pride comes before the fall. Now that there are increasing signs that the hegemony of the USA is crumbling bricks sends its regards, there is a growing danger that the great power, hated in many countries, will begin to strike blindly all around and also use its arsenal of weapons against China. The visit of the Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi, to Taiwan just now, in brazen disregard of the preceding exceptionally sharp warning from China, shows abundantly clearly the insolent arrogance and self-centeredness of the USA, which is behaving like a maddening elephant in a china shop and pushing its arrogance to ever higher peaks. Only the higher the rise, the thinner the air, the greater the danger of falling, and the deeper the fall. In the population of the USA, which has been separated into different factions, there are increasing signs of civil war-like conditions. And while in Washington, D.C., in the Pentagon, at the countless locations of the secret services and behind the shiny facades of the financial institutions and large corporations, the countries of the earth may already have been staked out in claims. A substantial part of the American population is languishing in poverty. Both the so-called working poor, the neglected in the vastness of the country, the chronically ill, the mentally ill war veterans and the descendants of the indigenous people in the reservations would certainly welcome it very much if, instead of $800 billion USD annually to the arms industry, this money were used for the benefit of general welfare, education, infrastructure, environmental protection, and for international understanding, etc. This would not only serve the American people, but also the whole world. There is virtually no sign of good governance left anywhere in the world, and even in Switzerland, which has been free of war since 1848. Ungovernable, stupid politicians have now disgracefully destroyed the island of peace status of neutrality that has been tried and tested for centuries and admired worldwide. Due to their moralistically clouded thinking, their poor understanding of history, their lack of a sense of reality and their disenchantment with democracy, etc., many Swiss politicians as well as senior administrators allow themselves to be dazzled and magically attracted like moths by the Las Vegas-like glamour of the EU dictatorship. Since they cannot distinguish appearance from reality, they are also incapable of recognizing and avoiding from the outset the destructive effects of their misguided actions on the freedom, peace, and welfare, etc. of the Swiss population.
The Great Taboo.
In this brief tour d'horizon, the fundamental and by far the greatest taboo of earthly humanity must of course not go unmentioned. It is no wonder that this capital crime, which fundamentally reinforces all other evils, is so taboo in view of the general misery on the executive floors. But it only clearly proves the cowardice, the intellectual deficit, and the faith-based bias, in general the shameful failure of all governments of all countries, as well as of the religions, the economy, and especially of the great majority of all environmental protection organizations, including the climate movement. The pinnacle of the ignorance of reality and the inability to think logically is demonstrated by the majority of politicians, academics, experts, business leaders, and journalists who are believers in the religion of steady quantitative growth and who perpetuate falling birth rates as a demographic catastrophe. Trapped in their mental lead cage, they do not realize that an annual global population increase of around 100 million human beings might have something to do with the consumption of resources, and that humanity has long been living at the expense of the substance of the planet. What can be explained to a child in an understandable way? Namely, that every human being, from infants to the elderly, is a consumer or user of resources, but also a producer of emissions, and that on a limited surface and with limited resources, a parasitic multiplication leads to entropy and destruction is apparently mentally unacceptable to many academically educated human beings. The confrontation with the word population growth over population, which is what we are talking about here, automatically switches certain important regions in their skulls to standby due to a belief-based overload protection. And because there is no sign that any government, let alone the economy, is willing to solve the problem of resource consumption and emissions at the root cause, preferring instead to confuse the symptoms with the cause and to set unrealistic and false targets for 2050. Which is understandable because they will then no longer be in charge of their office. Everything is getting more and more out of hand, exactly according to the law of cause and effect. If, in the case of an open leg fracture, the bone is not set, the visually disturbing and frightening wound is merely covered with a cloth and painkillers are administered as the only measure. Such an obviously inexpedient course of action corresponds exactly to what is proclaimed and striven for in politics and business and in the entire green spectrum as a way out. Stupidity distorted into the grotesque. A look at the history of human behavior and its observation clearly shows that terms like academically educated and clever do not automatically equate with reason and sanity. The simple calculation that the more eaters sit around a table with only one pot of soup, the less soup is available to the individual is obviously difficult to understand, as is the direct correlation between number of users, amount of resource consumption, and amount of emissions. In Switzerland, the immigration surplus from 2002 to 2017 was officially 1,012,546 persons, which corresponds to an annual increase of 63,285 human beings, which in turn corresponds to the population of the city of Lugano. In other words, Switzerland grew by 16 new cities in the period mentioned. Of course, the arrivals do not all live in tents and are also not all on foot, but need or use a vehicle, a flat, a refrigerator, heating, a shower, holidays, a way to work, digital devices, daily hot food, coffee, drinking goods, clothing, going to the cinema and restaurants, etc., etc. The attempt to relativize the situation by pointing out that not all immigrants must own a car is an attempt to deflect attention. Because the fact is that all human beings without exception, from infants to the elderly, are resource consumers to varying degrees, namely of fossil energy, because practically all plastic in all appliances and vehicles electric vehicles and household items and leisure articles and wind turbines and photovoltaic systems, etc., is obtained from crude oil and natural gas, as are directly or indirectly all metals, whereby coal or coke is also used in this respect, from clean water, which is collected, transported, purified and turned into dirty water through ingestion and external use, etc., as well as production processes and gardening agriculture, which has to be treated expensively or is mostly disposed of untreated into nature by eating food produced with combustion engines agriculture and delivered from all over the world ship, train, airplanes, trucks, which in turn is picked up from the supermarket with combustion engine vehicles, through a heated flat in cold days, by heating cooking, food, by installing solar cells produced in China, with material mined there in huge mines, generally by the use of metal-containing objects such as smartphones, which requires these metals and rare earths, etc., to be mined from the earth somewhere in Africa, South America, China, or Australia, with the vilified resource corporations ensuring that these metals, used by us all, are mined and made available of air, which is deprived of oxygen by respiration and emits CO2 instead, whereby the air is increasingly contaminated by many kinds of exhaust fumes, plastic particles in the nano range, many kinds of poisons and fertilizers, as well as the abrasion of tires on the roads, etc., and is distributed over all biospheres by wind and rain, through the keeping of dogs and cats, etc., for the feeding of which vast numbers of other animals have to be kept and slaughtered, by buying more food than is later used food waste, by building more and more houses and infrastructure due to the constant immigration and population growth, for which huge amounts of cement and sand, etc., are consumed using fossil fuels, etc. Not to be ignored, of course, are the social, psychological, and behavioral effects of population growth, unconscious density stress, interpersonal atrophy, progressive infirmity allergies, cancer, rampantly spreading diseases, new diseases, etc. Despite medical progress, progressive stupefaction through addictive behavior, digital abuse, medicines, drugs, stimulants, etc. The most impressive monument to earthly growth-oriented insanity, arrogant presumption, laziness of thought, irresponsibility towards nature with its fauna and flora, general after me the deluge egocentricity and civilizational decadence, as well as general indifference, can be seen when looking from above at all the countless megacities and agglomerations, etc., which, like metastasizing skin cancer in an advanced stage, proliferate into the surrounding area and parasitically assimilate what is still somewhat healthy into the ulcer. When experts try to convince politicians that climate change can be combated with the massive use of appropriate technology, electric cars instead of petrol, solar panels instead of gas, CO2 extractors in Iceland, self-driving cars against congested roads, CO2 levies, certificate trading, etc., or even before a definitive end to climate change, it is not enough. Or even before a final tipping point in about 10 years from today, then this is just as much a self-deception and illusionary symptom treatment as when climate activists think that they are substantially contributing to saving the climate if they stop buying plastic drinking straws. The truth is that climate change can no longer be stopped and is continuing virtually unchecked because the effective countermeasures should have been initiated 200 years ago. In China and India, there were once attempts to combat the causes, namely birth control measures, but these were abandoned due to inappropriate and abusive implementation and illogic. All calls to combat climate change through the use of technology serve at best to provide industry with orders and to soothe the guilty consciences of the callers and those who believe in them. The only way out to save what is still to be saved is primarily and urgently to be done on the social, interpersonal, and private level, that is to say, not by technical industrial means, namely by having far fewer children worldwide from now on and for many, many generations. This is the only possible humane way, renunciation through reason and a sense of responsibility. All other population reduction processes that will inevitably take place in the future according to the law of cause and effect, through brutal, drastic laws or through the rearing forces of nature, will be of a completely different caliber and will no longer have anything in common with the term humane. Unfortunately, this proposal and way out, which is based on combating causes and is the only sensible one, already fails when it is voiced, because short-sighted egoism and inability to think are much stronger than reason, a sense of responsibility and compassion for the coming generations.
What awaits us?
Since the proxy or hoped-for war of attrition between Ukraine and Russia, which is favorable for the geopolitical plans and intentions of the USA, will hardly end soon, indeed is actively promoted by NATO and the USA. An increasing escalation is certain. However, Russia will not allow itself to be defeated under any circumstances, because on the one hand, it is a matter of Russia's continued existence within its existing borders as an independent, self-deciding state, and not to end up as a vassal and prey of the West. And on the other hand, the Russian people have proven several times in the past that they are capable of suffering and are prepared to defend their country with all means against arrogant invaders. The next stage of escalation is already foreseeable, and again on European soil, namely the imminent admission of Finland and Sweden to NATO. Since Finland has a border of about 1,000 kilometers with Russia, it is to be expected that what happened in Ukraine will be repeated there, and that NATO, that is to say the USA, will infiltrate Finland with heavy weapons in the direction of the Russian border or push it in that direction with maneuvers. There is always a reason to invade, for example, through a so-called false flag action. If, for some reason, the passage of Russian ships through the straits into the Baltic Sea or the Atlantic is also obstructed or prevented, Russia's patience will once again be stretched. Then good night in Europe, and for both the military and the population. I wrote the following text, a kind of fable, on the 19th of February, 2022. Troubled by an ever-increasing stench of decay carried into the woods by the southwest wind for some time, the bear has emerged from among the trees. He has worried sense, sits upright, and moves his sharp claws. He is his forest. He wants to know the cause and does not run away cowardly. He faces the potential threat. Not far ahead of him, on a large poultry and livestock farm, both feathered and hairy cattle are in a frenzy. The chickens, geese, cattle, and sheep, etc. are in a panic. In crowing, howling, roaring, and bleating cacophony, they chase each other and over each other like yipping watchdogs. Some have already thrown themselves on their backs and are playing dead. An owl sits on a fir tree, gazing in wonder at the chaos, almost appearing to shake its head at the confused din below. A little further away, behind a stream, a horde of monkeys squat on a hill, hopping around madly, beating their chests and howling in the direction of the bear, as monkeys do when panicked. Beneath their feet, the floor is covered with a huge red, blue, and white tarpaulin with a star pattern. Below, invisible, the bestial stench seeps upwards from deep holes in the earth out into the landscape. In the holes lurk a pack of mangy wolves and hyenas, eyes glittering with deviousness and claws filthy with rotting carrion, ready to pounce at a moment's notice should the bear become heedless, annoyed by the din ahead, and rush into the fray to put things in order. But the bear does not act in the same way as a wolf or fox in a hen or sheep pen would act in a bloodlust. No, the bear is on guard, just like his colleagues behind the trees at the edge of the forest. On the 24th of February, 2022, the noise and the stench apparently became too much for the bear. It left the protective forest and began to bite. In an ancient tradition from pre-biblical times, we find, among other things, the following prediction of a man named Enoch, decoded for modern times. It will be different in the far west, in the United States of America, for it will be a land of utter destruction. The causes will be manifold. America, with its global conflicts, which are constantly breaking out and will also continue in the far future, is creating tremendous hatred against the USA in some countries worldwide. As a result, America will be faced with enormous catastrophes that will reach proportions that are hardly imaginable for the human beings of the earth. But Russia will not rest either, for it will attack Scandinavia and thus also extend everything to Europe, although months before that, a terrible hurricane will sweep over northern Europe and devastate and destroy an enormous amount. The Russian attack, it must be said, will take place in the summertime, starting from Arkhangelsk. But Denmark will not be included in the war action, for which the reasons will lie in the insignificance of the country.
Source: Contact Report 215.
In July 1949, 12-year-old Eduard A. Meyer from Bülow, Switzerland wrote the following poem, which he sent to various government officials, newspapers and radio stations without ever receiving a reply. America and Europe will tremble when freedom comes from the East with a hard hand, which is suppressed from America and Europe, but which will be punished by a hard teaching, for the sense of world domination which they wickedly cherish, and thus put countries and peoples into dictatorships. The Great Bear will come, who will bring freedom, Russian land, which will put down all the unfreedom that rings out of many mouths in America and Europe, as it does in many other countries around the world. But the bear from the East will destroy it and settle the whole thing into peace and freedom. But it will take a long time until then, with lamentations that are carried out into the world with tears, because evil terrorism, dictatorship, hatred and war deny peace and freedom victory. Might and greed for world domination are tearing the world apart, and in many countries there are even death cries, because America and Europe are carrying out unfreedom and beating the human beings with war, need, and misery. The peacemakers, whose actions are based on might, are taught by the bear and told that claims to world power stir up evil strife, which leads humanity to death and ruin. Therefore, the bear will tear apart all the evil of America, and it will also promise the same to Europe. When wars violently destroy everything in the world, crisscrossing from the world striking America, when the same echoes from the European dictatorship and cries of murder resound from evil terrorism, then the bear will start to bite at the strife, and this will tear apart the evil doings of the Western powers. The 7th of July, 1949.